Well, good morning. It is Monday, April the 1st, 2024, and I'm at my kitchen table. Um, I had an interview this past Friday with Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis, and it was probably one of the more informative interviews I've done. Confirmed some things that I was thinking. He was very informative, and I was very appreciative of his time. I am having to edit that. We lost internet connection about halfway through the interview, mysteriously enough, while we were talking about Israel. So I have chose to leave out most of that. What had happened was I had to call him back, and I forgot to hit record. But some information has come to light on CBS possibly misreporting, and Israel came back and made some statements, and I'm still unclear as to what I believe and think about Israel's statements about that circumstance. But we're going to hold off on that, and I'm just going to give you what I feel was pertinent for the time. Um, Folks, I don't know what the hour holds for us, but I do know we are in some precarious times, and this country is in a precarious time. And so, watch this, listen prayerfully, and do your own research. Don't go off of what I say or what Bob says. Do your own research. You have got to know for yourself. But here's the deal, you've got to seek it out. You know, in Proverbs, and I can't remember um, the verse right now at the moment, but it says, it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and it is the glory of kings to search it out. So we are kings and priests, a royal, a royal priesthood, as Peter put it. And um, also in Proverbs it says to buy the truth and sell it not. So, man, don't just ignore it. That is probably the worst thing you can do is just go, well, God's got this. Well, yeah, he does. But he's given you a brain. He's given you common sense, and he's given you the ability to hear truth. So, without further ado, here we go. All right, welcome to Justice and Judgment. I've got retired Lieutenant Colonel Robert McGinnis with me today. And Bob, I appreciate you taking the time. I just want, and I didn't want to keep you long. I wanted to cover just a couple of subjects, or basically the same subject, but I think that we're closer than we think, either, to our end times or what's going on in our country with the possibility of war. And I tend to think that we're actually in a cold civil war, and I think we're already in World War III. Based on if you believe the book Unrestricted Warfare, and I'm sure you're quite familiar with that book. What got me started on this thought process was I had watched. It was a 2-hour interview with Eric Prince, formerly owner of Blackwater. And I don't know what you think about Eric or not, but he 70% sure that China was behind the AT&T attack. And in that interview, I learned a lot of military things, how we're probably wasting money as a country. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as far as the possible cyber attack, just as a warning to us, which could also lead into what I think Laura Logan was saying was a cyber attack on our country by way of that bridge that collapsed on us. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, there are a host of issues you bring up there, Chris. Interestingly, before Eric Prince went to SEAL school, I knew him. He was an intern at the Family Research Council, where I was the vice president. I knew his parents, and then I've had a little contact with Eric over the last couple of decades. But yeah, I did know him and his affiliations with Blackwater and some of his people in Iraq who I met, and so forth. The cyber attacks are real. Treasury Department has, warned consistently as Homeland Security, with a phalanx of activists and organizations inside Communist China that are constantly going after our infrastructure and trying to plant malware inside our electric and water grids. It's not a surprise at all. The Russians do much the same. North Koreans, Iranians, and other bad actors, whether they're nation states or criminal syndicates, cyber is a new, domain in which people try to gain an upper hand. And so I'm not the least surprised. You mentioned the Chinese book on restricted warfare. And of course, that was written by a couple of Chinese colonels decades ago. Essentially, what it talks about is how you use all the instruments of national power to defeat your adversary. And it's clear to me, and I've written about this in Kings of the East and Alliance of Evil and a number of other books, that the Chinese pull out all stops and in a very low key but very traceable mechanism go after the United States as its primary enemy. And so it uses cyber, it uses drugs like fentanyl, going through the cartels in Mexico. It uses manipulation of personnel, such as buying off the Bidens or manipulating Hollywood. It buys up media outlets and controls them. It buys up farmland. It buys up all sorts of things. And of course, if you want to go into their country, much less into places like Hong Kong, you face a very significant uphill battle trying to gain a leverage to do meaningful business. And that's why a lot of businesses are now vacating Hong Kong and mainland China, even though it's a massive population of 1.4 plus billion people. That is very enticing to businesses, but it's becoming much more difficult to do business in China. And besides, the Chinese economy is in the doldrums. It's going down, not up, after many years of radical increases. But at the same time, they're increasing their defense budgets this past year 8%. And of course, they've tightened the noose on Hong Kong. And I suspect, as the Indo-PACOM commander recently said, they'll probably in the next couple of years go after Taiwan, either legitimately through kinetic operations, military invasion, or through other pressure mechanisms. But there's every intention by President Xi and his party to take over Taiwan. And of course, that will involve other issues in the region with Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Vietnam, South China Sea, etc. In terms of global instability, there's no doubt we have, and totalitarians are forming, alliances of convenience, not all that different from the 1930s when the Nazis and the Soviets formed an alliance. And then, of course, the Nazis, the Italians, and the Japanese formed an alliance. More recently, of course, we have what I call the Alliance of Evil, subject of my book, 2018, that China and Russia are essentially in an alliance, an economic alliance, certainly a military alliance, sharing technologies and, reducing the threat posed by one or another on the other. And then, of course, the Russians are very cozy with the North Koreans, who are providing arms to Russia for the continuation of the war in Ukraine. And of course, even Tehran is providing all sorts of technologies, especially drone technologies, unmanned aerial vehicles, to the Russians for use against the Ukrainians. All of this is destabilizing the world, and it doesn't help the fact that we have a out of control U.S. government under Mr. Biden, who is incredibly leftist and is leaning and his foreign policy is totally bankrupt. But that's perhaps for another day.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Russia because I had uh, I had come across this man Yuri Bezmenov, and I guess he was a defector from Russia, and I guess he passed away back in the 90s. But he talks about the four stages, and which kind of went along with the three stages of destruction that I saw in a movie that I mentioned that I'd watched, Leaving the World Behind by uh, actually Mr. Obama was an executive producer and a writer for that, him and his wife, which I thought was odd because if Ronald Reagan had done it, I'd have gotten that because he spent time in Hollywood. But as far as I know, Mr. Obama didn't have any Hollywood experience. And I wouldn't recommend watching that movie to anybody. My wife and I had to go out back and scrape ourselves off and hose off with a hose and take a shower because it was pretty raunchy in some parts. But I wanted to see the message that they were trying to convey. And there at the end he talked about three stages, isolation, synchronized chaos, and civil war. Well, Mr. Bezmenov says that they had four stages, which is demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and then normalization. And it appears to me, and if you comment on this, it looks like they've kind of successfully almost done all of those. And I think we're waiting on the crisis to hit, or if we already haven't had the crisis.
Yeah, it's interesting. It reminds me of a conversation I had with Tom Horn a number of years ago on those four stages and how we kind of outlined, what was happening in the United States and more broadly in the West. There is certainly a very clear agenda by the totalitarian part of the world to replace the Cold War, post-Cold War, democratic international institutions, structures that have held us together using Western values. And so what these nations want to do with their proxies here in the United States and in the West is to kind of go through something similar to those four stages that ultimately ends up in their controlling what is today the West, and tomorrow they hope to be part of their global world dominance. I've said in a number of my books that whether it's the deeper state or collision course or some of the others, that we are going through a transformation which is pretty evil. I think it's being hosted to a large degree by proxies that most secularists will never understand, and that is that they're proxies of the devil, and they're doing the deeds of true Marxists. Marxists are basically proxies. Maybe they're disembodied, yes, demons. I don't know. But what we are facing is instability, and we're seeing it every day in the United States, and I think there's a large section of our population that's very concerned about the what perceived to be the coming crisis after destabilization, southern border, bad economy, just radical social experimentation. Just defunding the police. All these things are not by coincidence or happenstance, they're by design. And that's how these Marxists are destabilizing our culture. And so, I think we're facing potential crises. Now, hopefully we can remove the regime that's inside the White House today and replace it with people that exercise godly guidance. But I don't know if this is the end times, but certainly all the indicators are there. But I would argue also, Chris, that if I were in Germany in 1935, 36, I would have seen something all that and not that different. If I was inside China in 1966 to 76, and I saw some of that when I was in Hong Kong in the early 70s. But you thought the entire country was or world was falling apart. So uh, there yet may be hope for this clan of Earthlings that somehow will discard the Marxist influence and the radicalism that is perpetrated by the likes of Putin and Xi and others, and will return to some normality. But it may be the prophetic end times, and we may be rushing in that direction. It's just hard for all of us to know in the present time, though these are really trying, whether or not we are going in that direction.
Bob, you have a new book coming out. I don't know if you want to mention it or not. It's going to come out, I believe, in the fall.
No, actually, it's coming out May 1st there, Chris.
Oh, May 1st. Okay, I misunderstood something.
Yeah, it's Out of This World, and it's the byline is, are UFOs aliens, spirits, or hokum? And I've gone through all of the U.S. government and foreign government programs, looking at those, looking at the data that's been collected by nonprofits around the world. What's happening, I would argue, and I provide ample evidence of this, is after showing all of that, I believe there's a great deception going on, and it's a spiritual issue.
Yes.
And, I think even though the Bible doesn't talk about, quote, aliens, it talks a lot about spirits, about angels, about demons, about end times prophecy. And I just think it's the perfect approach for a Christian to appreciate what's happening, more broadly than this whole bit about UFOs, but more broadly about the spiritual war that is really building up before our very eyes. And so, I was fortunate that years ago I met Chuck Missler, long before, just before Chuck went to be with the Lord, and I've used some of his insights in kind of interpreting how this UFO phenomenon really morphs into end times prophecy, and especially the Antichrist. And I think it's pretty firm biblically and historically. It's fascinating. The science is fascinating as well. Most people, I grew up on the fringes of the U.S. space race, going to the moon, because my stepfather worked at all these places. I went to school outside the Marshall Space Flight Center, worked at lived near Cape Kennedy, California, in the space program. So I've experienced that, and I have a science background, so I deal with all of that. But it's the spiritual issues that I don't think that, certainly the Pentagon doesn't deal with, and most Americans haven't even, raised the veil to consider, what we're seeing today and what's being reported about so-called UFOs is really just part and parcel to the spiritual war that's ongoing. I think it's overwhelming, the evidence, but people will need to read the book and come to their own conclusions, but I certainly have.
Well, I know the church has steered clear of that because it's the unknown, and they don't want to appear to be full of hokum like you write in the book there. And so I think out of that fear, they've really stayed uneducated and not allowed themselves to at least explore the possibilities. And I'm with you. I think if anything, it's gonna bring about that great deception. In Matthew 24, 3 times, actually 4 times, if you count he talks about even the elect being deceived, but he mentions in a very short amount of time, don't be deceived. And I really think that's very important, in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so when in one chapter he says, don't be deceived 3 times, I think that maybe we need to not be deceived. So I'm anxious to see that book come out, and I think it's going to be a real eye opener.
Well, I expect that it will be. The church today isn't serious about its faith. It doesn't count, the wisdom that God gives us in His Word and through His Holy Spirit all that seriously. And as a direct result of that, I think we're incredibly gullible to even the church to believe in so-called science, which really doesn't understand, the unseen realm.
Right.
And it's so real, and yet, Christians by large numbers are just as manipulated by what the so-called science and the left has been propagating. It's time to come out of that, being naive about what's happening around us, and spiritually awaken to what's happening right before our very eyes.
Amen. I couldn't agree 100% more. Well, Bob, thank you so much for your time. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and He has risen.
Thanks, Chris, and He has risen indeed.
All right. God bless you, sir. Thank you.